Welcome outside Gillette Stadium again, everybody. My name is Mike Petraglia, joined as always by Patriots expert columnist for WEEI.com, Christopher Price. All right, Chris, since last we met back in January when the Patriots were eliminated by the Denver Broncos in the AFC Championship, the Patriots went through a roster rebuild, as you like to call it, and as Nick Caserio called it here on Tuesday inside Gillette Stadium. What were your biggest takeaways from some of the big additions, Martellus Bennett, the tight end, and Chris Long, the defensive end?
I think that I always fall back on the phrase that John Wooden used, talking about specific to basketball, but don't confuse activity for achievement. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the Patriots' approach to the offseason, whether it's free agency, whether it's trades, whatever the case may be. Not a lot of big splashes this year. Not like last year. They lose Revis, they lose Arrington, they lose Browner. It's been a relatively, and I want to stress the word relatively, uneventful offseason. I think the moves that they've made have done enough to allow them to tread water while the rest of the AFC is kind of pulled back a little bit. Specifically, I want to mention the Broncos, with the uncertainty around their quarterback situation. But I think when you look at the moves the Patriots made, they've picked up some very valuable veterans. Chris Long strikes me as a professional, a guy who gets it, who's been around the league for a handful of years. Terrence Knighton, another guy, a professional who's been around the league a handful of years, understands his business, understands his job. Martellus Bennett, fascinating guy, and I know we want to get into this. He brings a different dynamic to the field, to the locker room. There were some people in Chicago who said he might have worn out his welcome with the Bears a little bit. So, and then you figure put Chris Hogan into the mix. It's a really intriguing group of prospects. I don't want to, make a kind of a broad brush judgment on them, but I think a lot of these guys at least shape up right now as really intriguing fits in Foxborough.
All right, let's focus right now, defensive side of the ball. The three names I want to focus on just to start: Terrence Knighton, Pot Roast Knighton in the middle of the defensive line, Chris Long on the outside, and Shea McClellan. He's a fascinating character, I think, in terms of the versatility he brings and how Bill Belichick might use him.
Yeah, I think McClellan is a really interesting guy on a number of levels, including the fact that they asked him to do a lot over his the last 3 years in Chicago. And I think if I'm the Patriots, I kind of narrow that responsibility a little bit. I know that they love guys who are versatile. They love guys who can do multiple things. But at the same time, I don't know how much he really needs to do in this defense. And again, this is something we were talking about before. I wouldn't be surprised. McClellan, Long, Knighton, some of the moves that they made on the defensive side of the ball this year, we see more 3-4 than 4-3. McClellan specifically, I think he was at his best when he was an inside linebacker in Chicago. I think he'd be a really good fit if you're talking about a 3-4 here in New England.
You know why that strikes me as interesting, Chris, is they did just the opposite with Jabal Sheard. Jabal Sheard was pretty much focused in on one specific role with the Cleveland Browns. He comes here to Cleveland, and Bill Belichick uses him more on the inside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's different. And look, different guys, different situations, different level of responsibility. But you can also make that same statement when you're talking about Chris Long. I think Chris Long, it's debatable where he is at this stage of his career, but I think right now, at this moment, before he even puts on pads, he projects to be an Andre Carter type. And Andre Carter proved to be kind of a not a situational, but more of a pass rush type of guy. And that's what he really developed into when he was here in New England. A guy who's over 30, been around for a while, still professional, still can bring a lot to the game, but you want to be able to narrow down those responsibilities. You want to be able to give them a very specific level of responsibility. I think Long, Knight, and McClellan, they've done really well over the course of their careers. Again, I'm going to be fascinated to see where they fit in here as it relates to the New England defense.
You think Terrence Knighton might give some words of advice besides all of the posting he's been doing on Instagram to Tom Brady and how he managed to get to Tom Brady a few times over his career?
Look, if Pot Roast, Martellus Bennett, and Chris Long are half as good on the field as they are at social media, we're all going to be standing around at Super Bowl 51 talking about the great acquisitions that this team has made. I do. I think that Knighton is, again, we've used this phrase before, but Knighton's a fascinating guy. Knighton's a nose tackle. You're not looking at a defensive end type.
He's a two-gap
nose
tackle,
exactly.
Like Vince.
Exactly. He is the first guy. He harkens back, and we were talking about this on the radio the other day, he harkens back to the Ted Washington, early Vince Wilfork, Keith Traylor, those type of guys. You're not going to be asking him to do play a lot of defensive tackle in a four-man front. Long is, again, he can do a few things, but I'm fascinated to see if they do end up playing more 3-4 this year, if they're going to ask Chris Long to drop into coverage a little bit and run with maybe some linebackers and run with some tight ends. I'm sorry. Again, it's going to be interesting how all of this shakes out. It's very, very early in the process, But Martellus Bennett, I know Martellus Bennett is the guy that you wanted to talk about because for a couple of reasons. He's in the last year of his contract, and I think if Martellus Bennett thinks he's going to come in here and catch 90 passes and go to free agency with a fat new contract, I think it's going to be different. I think he maybe needs to manage his expectations a little bit.
And not to interrupt you, but you would think Bill Belichick and the Patriots told him that.
Yeah, you would hope that they've had that conversation. Now, was Bennett going to be a one-year-and-out guy? I think there's a possibility there. I think if he comes here, he likes it, there's a possibility for a longer-term deal. But I think right now, if he's here for 1 year, he gets some of what I call that Patriots cologne on him, goes back out into the open market, and feels pretty good about where he is. But I think he needs to manage some expectations. If that conversation hasn't already been had, he comes in here to an offense where he is going to be, the third option, the fourth option, if everything works out perfectly. You have Gronkowski, Edelman, Amendola, and he's going to be a little bit further down the food chain than he was a couple of years ago with the Bears. It's going to be fascinating to see how all of that plays out, how all the targets are distributed in the New England offense.
So you mentioned what position in the depth chart or in terms of the priority chart for Tom Brady, Martellus Bennett might be. I'm fascinated to see how the Danny Amendola story really plays out because with the additions of Chris Hogan and Nate Washington, I'll ask you, how will that impact Danny Amendola going forward?
The most intriguing thing about Amendola, the money isn't guaranteed until the week before the start of the regular season. So we could have a situation on our hands here that mirrors what happened with Lawyer Malloy in 2003 and Logan Mankins a couple of years ago. They may try and trade him. If there's an injury in training camp, if there's an injury this offseason, then he gets a little bit more of the leverage. So this is a story that has yet to be written when you're talking about Amendola. There is some uncertainty around him, around his contract. Does he want to take another pay cut? He already took a pay cut here. He's been a good soldier, been a very good teammate, developed into a really important part of this offense. Well, it's bringing some good special teams value to the table. So that's going to be a story that's going to continue to play out over the course of the spring and the summer because the team and Amendola said they have a little bit of wiggle room here. They have a little bit of leeway when you're talking about dealing with this situation because really the payment doesn't come due until right before the start of the regular season.
Donald Brown, is he just a little bit more, is he only insurance for Dion Lewis, assuming that Dion Lewis isn't 100% ready to go to start the season?
This isn't the Donald Brown that we saw in Indy a couple of years ago. He really struggled the last couple of years in San Diego. And you could argue, well, is it injury? Is it just he was being misused? I'm fascinated to see him and what he can bring because he's going to have some opportunity really early on. And I want to see how he does when talking about getting acclimated to the offense, talking about, because they do ask their backs to do different things here in New England as opposed to some other places. So he projects to be a really intriguing fit with his team, just a matter of whether or not he's going to be able to take advantage of some of those opportunities that he's been given.
Who is the running back from the Indianapolis Colts that they brought in here and didn't even make it out of training camp and can't remember his name? That's
Joseph
what
Adai.
That's what this kind of reminds me of a little bit. Same kind of system, same kind of player. Do you think there are some similarities there with Brown and Adai?
I think Adai was a little bit further on in his career. I'd be surprised right now, knowing what I do know about Donald Brown and his situation, if he didn't make it here. He's just going to call it a career. Adai fundamentally, during the conditioning test, said, all right, that's it, I'm done, and walked off the field and didn't play another down in the NFL for the rest of his life. And so I don't think that Brown is quite there yet. But again, they've taken chances on these guys. He, at least on the offensive side of the ball right now, is that guy who they just want to see what he's got left. And if he can still play and if he can still contribute. Look, the running back situation is really fluid here. There's a possibility that they go out and they spend one of those high-value picks in the draft at the running back position. There's still a handful of guys kicking around out there. They cycle through running backs here in New England like nobody's business. We know that LeGarrette Blount just came back. So right now you have a depth chart of Blount, Dion Lewis, James White, Brandon Bolden, and Donald Brown. Right. And so I don't know if any one of those guys really, other than a healthy Dion Lewis, maybe blows you away. But there could be a possibility for someone else to come in here, a draft pick, whatever the case may be. One other note specifically as it relates to the backfield, the return of James Devlin. I think that's a story that we didn't write enough about last year. That was one of the more underrated storylines. Devlin is a terrific blocker, and Devlin hits his mark almost every single time. And I think one of the reasons that the running game struggled down the stretch last year and into the postseason, they lost some guys, but I think the loss of Devlin, he is absolutely important to what they want to do when it comes to moving the ball on the ground consistently.
I know you are on the Patriots Hall of Fame committee, actually does their business right inside the building we're taping this outside of. And I wanted to get your impressions. I know Nick Caserio spoke at length about some of the finalists for the Patriots Hall of Fame. I want to go over your thoughts and feelings on some of the guys that are on there, like a Mike Vrabel, like a Raymond Claiborne.
I'm a Kevin Falk apologist. We've talked about that before.
We sure have, and deservedly so.
Yeah, I think that, and it's funny, you can vote on Patriots.com between now and May 14th, and then they announce the winner, and then they have the thing out here before the start of the preseason game in August or September. Out of that group, and you can debate who got in and who didn't get in. I know the big debate has been Parcells. Does he deserve a shot?
I think he does.
Yeah, I think at this point he's been a finalist 3 times. My philosophy is it's not going to happen, at least in this environment. The fans are not going to vote him in. So I think you're left right now with Falk, Vrabel, Claiborne. You can make a lot of arguments for all 3 of them. Like I said, I'm a Kevin Falk guy. I've been a Kevin Falk guy for a long time. I think it's important the fact that he played his entire career here, that he remade himself a couple of times, that he essentially went through a couple of reboots here over the course of his professional career. He was now super professional, absolutely vital to what they did offensively. No one was more trusted in the passing game when he was here. I'm talking about no one.
Right.
Not Wes Welker, not Rob Gronkowski, not Randy Moss. No one was more valued, no one was more trusted to the New England passing game, to Tom Brady specifically, than Kevin Falk. And I think out of that entire group, I'm going with Kevin Falk. That's not to dismiss Raymond Claiborne. That's not to dismiss a guy like Mike Vrabel. But Falk, for me, was the absolute pinnacle of what a New England Patriot should be, and I think he should be rewarded accordingly.
Your takeaways on the 2016 Patriots schedule, some of the highlights for you. I know they start a Sunday night out in Arizona against old friend Chandler Jones and company. I think that's a fascinating way to start the season.
It is, and I think it's set up for them, that game aside. Then you have 3 straight home games, and I think it's set up for a quick start. I think the Arizona game is going to be a difficult game, and it, quite frankly, could be one of the 3 or 4 games this year, right now as we sit here, that they could lose when you look at the opponents and when you look at where they have to go and who they have to play. But you have another 3 games at home right after that. There are no gauntlets like we saw a couple of years ago. There's no,
5 or 6 game stretches in West Coast.
Yeah, there's a November-December stretch that includes a road game in Denver, a road game with the Jets, home game against the Seahawks. That could get a little dicey. But I think that this schedule, to me, certainly suggests 13-3, 12-4. I mean, but we sit here, we make this, we have this discussion, every single year.
Right.
And every single year they turn out to go 13-3, 12-4. The one thing I think that will give Patriots fans a little bit of pause, New Year's Day in Miami. You want to be able to make that game absolutely irrelevant.
Well, there are those who would say, Chris, that they made that game absolutely irrelevant by their own choosing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and
it cost them.
Yeah, it was funny. I did a spot with South Florida radio this week, and we still went back and discussed the approach to that game and what the Patriots decided to do and who they played and who they didn't play and how that impacted them, going forward into the postseason. So I think if you're the Patriots, you want to do what you can do to be able to have everything locked up. So you're playing on South Beach on New Year's Day in a game that means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, we'll see how that turns out this time around. We'll have all of the coverage of the Patriots draft coming up next week on WEEI.com. Christopher Price and Ryan Hannibal and yours truly will be all over it, giving you team coverage on the It Is What It Is blog on WEEI.com. Until then, he is Christopher Price. I'm Mike Petraglia, outside Gillette Stadium, WEEI.com.